All right, ready and go. Hi, my name is Mr. Evangelista, and today we're going to be talking about evolution. The man most closely associated with evolution is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, what he did was he went on this boat called the HMS Beagle, and he went on a 5-year journey. He went around, the tip of Africa, and he also went around the tip of South America all the way to the Galapagos Island. And what he did along this journey was he collected specimens, and he compared those specimens to each other. He found that there were differences between species globally, but there were also some similarities. For example, he found this bird called the rhea, which was very similar to another bird which existed in Africa, the ostrich. But the rhea was found in South America, and the ostrich was found in Africa. And he was wondering how this came about. He also found differences locally, at the local level. So he looked at the Isabella Island turtle and the Hood Island turtle, and he found that their shells were different, allowing them to stretch their necks differently to reach different levels of vegetation. He was wondering how and why these differences occurred. Lastly, he found differences over time. So he found this fossil, the Glyptodont, and he compared it to a modern day creature called the armadillo. And he was wondering why the Glyptodont was no longer in existence, yet this very similar creature, the armadillo, we find today. And so to help Darwin piece together all of this evidence he found, he looked to the work of several important people. Now, the first of those is Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was this English economist who studied human populations, and he found that more people were being born than the cities could support, which led to overcrowding, which he theorized would eventually lead to war, death, or famine. Now, Darwin applied Malthus's ideas to these species that he was studying. He noticed that an organism would have many offspring, but only certain offspring would survive. And he asked himself, why is it and what makes it so that this organism survives and this organism doesn't? So that's what he looked at from Malthus's ideas. He also looked at another person who had a theory about evolution, and that was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was also able to figure out that organisms are different from each other. And his theory as to how organisms were able to make that change was he thought that a giraffe had a long neck because a giraffe constantly used its neck to reach the high branches of trees. And because this giraffe was using his neck a lot, the neck got longer. Giraffe would have a baby who also had a long neck, and that giraffe would further reach and that neck would get longer, and so on and so forth. And so this was Lamarck's theory of evolution. He had the same ideas as Darwin, the fact that things are different, but he had a different theory as to how those organisms acquired those traits. The last person that Darwin looked at was Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell was a geologist, and he saw that the Earth changed over time. So Darwin looked at Lyell's ideas about how the Earth changes over time and applied that to organisms, saying that organisms can also change over time. So Darwin took all of this evidence, all of the ideas of other scientists and other researchers and philosophers, and he came up with his theory of natural selection. Natural selection has these 5 components in it. Number 1, there are variations in traits. So there are differences in the traits which we saw with those organisms that he was studying. Number 2, more organisms are born than can survive, and this is Thomas Malthus's idea. Number 3, there are variations, and certain variations will increase the fitness of that organism. And if there is a variation that helps you survive, we call that an adaptation. Now, fitness is not this idea where you go to the gym and you get really fit, you get really yoked. Fitness is a measure of your reproductive success. So if you are able to have a lot of babies, a lot of offspring, you are considered fit. The 4th component of Darwin's natural selection theory was that offspring inherit the variations. So if there is a variation that helps you survive, your children are also going to have those variations. Lastly, over time and many generations later, these adaptations that help you survive, because they helped you survive and reproduce, they will become more common. So let's take a look at what this looks like. We can have a mouse, and the mouse will have offspring, but there are also predators on this island with the mouse, and the predator will eat the mice, and then there's this kind of cycle where the mouse will have offspring and the owl will eat the offspring. Now, every once in a while, the mouse will have an offspring, and that offspring will have a mutation. Now, that mutation could be a beneficial mutation, meaning it's an adaptation, or it could be a harmful mutation and actually make you more likely to die. So these mutations, if they lead to you having an adaptation, meaning increasing your fitness, you are more likely to survive, and therefore you are more likely to pass on the genes that you have. And over time, you can see that the adaptations will be selected for because the organisms that do not have those adaptations will end up dying. Now let's take a look at another island with a very similar mouse. We can see that we had mutations in this generation, and the traits that are adapted to survive are selected for. We can see that over time, these islands become different from each other. One island has the white mice, and one island has the black mice, and that is selected for because of its environment. And now, this is a very basic example, but we can see how over time and many generations, and maybe adaptations later, we get these differences where this turtle has a short neck or this turtle has a long neck. Now, something I want you guys to figure out is what kind of adaptations or changes might happen to the predator, the owl in this case, in response to the changes that happen in the mice on the two islands. So if you guys could respond to that below and maybe have a discussion, and we'll see what kind of ideas you guys come up with. Now, how do these variations come about? We already mentioned one of them, and that's through a mutation. Mutations are errors in the copying of DNA. DNA is this really long molecule, and when we replicate, we have to copy it, and sometimes there are errors in the copying of those DNA. Now, the second way we can get variations is through a concept of gene flow, and gene flow, all that means is migration, meaning something can migrate into our population and cause a variation that way. The last way we can get variation is through crossing over and independent assortment. Crossing over happens in meiosis when the chromosomes will exchange portions of their DNA, creating new combinations that weren't available in the original parents. We also have independent assortment during metaphase of meiosis. The homologous chromosomes are going to line up, and they can line up in various different patterns, leading into a lot of different combinations. So natural selection is nature being the selecting factor that causes these changes over time in the traits of these organisms. But there's also artificial selection, and that happens when humans become the selecting factor. And this is why we have a bunch of fancy pigeons. This is why we have pigs and cows that are domesticated. This is why we have dogs of different breeds. So how artificial selection works, let's say in the case of the fancy pigeons, is that breeders will breed pigeons, and they'll breed them over many generations. And they will look for a pigeon that has a rare mutation that makes it look fancy. Maybe it's got some fancy feathers or something like that. And they will take those fancy pigeons and use those as the parents for further breeding. And you can see over time, and maybe many mutations later, we can get a wide variety of different pigeons. And so the selection factor in artificial selection are the humans who are breeding these animals rather than a predator or some type of lack of resource in the environment. I hope this video was helpful. If you want a copy of the animation, you can find it in the link in the description below. Also, a lot of time and resources go into the creation of these videos. So if you found any value at all in these videos or learned something, please consider following me on Patreon. I would like to increase the production value of my videos, and a way that you guys can help with that is by following me on Patreon.